The stench hit Secretary Ulrich Zuttel like a physical blow as he entered the imperial chamber that sweltering June morning in 1492, the blackened flesh of Emperor Frederick's left leg, announcing that death had finally come, calling for the House of Habsburg. Quick favor. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see the global reach of this story. This was no ordinary royal sickness. Frederick III had ruled the Holy Roman Empire for 53 years, surviving assassination attempts, rival claimants, and countless political storms through sheer stubborn endurance. Now, at 77, his own body had become his most dangerous enemy. Zuttel pressed a perfumed cloth to his nose as he approached the massive four-poster bed where the emperor lay propped against silk pillows. The leg wound that had plagued Frederick for months had transformed into something medieval. Physicians could only describe as mortification of the flesh, black veins spider-webbed outward from an ulcer the size of a man's palm, and the surrounding skin had taken on the waxy yellow pallor that experienced courtiers recognized as death's calling card. "Your Majesty," Zuttel began carefully, his voice muffled by the cloth. The emperor's eyes, once sharp enough to outmaneuver kings and popes, now struggled to focus. Frederick had built his reign on patience and careful calculation, earning the nickname the Peaceful through his preference for negotiation over warfare. But no amount of diplomatic skill could negotiate with gangrene. The imperial physician, Paul Laxmond, hovered nearby with his leather satchel of increasingly desperate remedies. He had already tried every treatment known to 15th century medicine: bloodletting to balance the humors, poultices of ground pearls and unicorn horn, even applications of boiling wine that had left Frederick screaming until his voice gave out. Nothing had slowed the inexorable spread of corruption through the imperial flesh. What made this medical catastrophe particularly terrifying was its timing. The Habsburg dynasty balanced precariously on Frederick's shoulders, with his son Maximilian away campaigning in the Low Countries, battling French forces for control of Burgundy. A power vacuum in Vienna could trigger a succession crisis that would shatter the empire Frederick had spent decades consolidating. The emperor stirred on his pillows, and Zuttel leaned closer to catch his whispered words. "The leg," Frederick rasped, his German accent thick with pain and fever. "It burns like the fires of hell itself." The irony was not lost on those present. Frederick had spent his reign defending Christendom against Ottoman expansion, yet now faced his own personal inferno within the supposed safety of his palace walls. Outside the chamber windows, Vienna bustled with summer activity. Merchants hawking goods in the cobblestone squares, apprentices hurrying between workshops, citizens going about their daily lives in blissful ignorance of the medical drama unfolding in the Hofburg. The contrast was stark. While an empire hung in the balance, ordinary life continued its eternal rhythm. But could the Habsburg dynasty survive what was coming next? Laxmand had privately confided to the imperial confessor that the blackening indicated mortification beyond earthly remedy. In plain terms, Frederick's leg was rotting while still attached to his living body, poisoning his blood with every heartbeat. The emperor's breathing had become labored, each inhalation a visible struggle that sent ripples of concern through the assembled courtiers. These were men who had witnessed Frederick's legendary endurance, his ability to outlast opponents through sheer persistence, his talent for turning apparent defeats into long-term victories. Seeing him reduced to this gasping, fever-racked figure challenged their fundamental understanding of imperial power. Frederick's marriage to Eleanor of Portugal had produced only one surviving son, making Maximilian's absence particularly dangerous. Without a clear succession, rival branches of the Habsburg family might press competing claims, while foreign powers would inevitably seek to exploit the chaos. The French, the Hungarians, even the ever-present Ottoman threat, all would see opportunity in imperial weakness. As if reading these dark thoughts, Frederick suddenly gripped Zuttel's wrist with surprising strength. "Summon," he wheezed, "summon the surgeons from Linz. There must be." His voice trailed off as another wave of fever swept over him, leaving him unconscious and burning to the touch. The decision facing the Imperial Council was unprecedented in its horror. Medieval surgery was a last resort reserved for the desperate, with survival rates that made battlefield wounds seem preferable. Yet without intervention, the gangrene would certainly kill the emperor within weeks. What none of them could imagine was that Frederick's ordeal had barely begun, and the surgical solution they were contemplating would prove more gruesome than anything yet witnessed in the blood-soaked annals of Habsburg history. The heated sledge carved through knee-deep snow as Emperor Frederick's fever-racked body endured the 100-mile journey to Linz, each jolt sending fresh agony through his gangrenous leg while his temperature soared to 102 degrees. This desperate winter evacuation represented the last hope for Habsburg survival. If Frederick died without securing the succession, the empire would fragment into warring territories within months. January 8th, 1493, marked the beginning of the most harrowing medical ordeal in imperial history. The sledge, hastily fitted with a portable brazier and lined with wolf pelts, moved at walking pace through the Austrian countryside. Inside, Frederick drifted between consciousness and delirium while his attendants struggled to keep him warm enough to survive the journey, yet cool enough to prevent his fever from climbing to fatal levels. Court physician Laxmand rode alongside, checking the emperor's pulse every half hour through a gap in the sledge's leather covering. What he found horrified him. Frederick's heart raced at nearly double its normal rhythm, desperately pumping infected blood through his deteriorating system. The physician's notes, hastily scrawled by candlelight at roadside inns, record a man dying by degrees, while still clinging to imperial authority. The destination was Linzburg, where the renowned surgeon Hans Seyf maintained his practice. Seyf had earned his reputation treating battlefield wounds during the Hungarian campaigns, developing techniques that pushed the boundaries of 15th century medicine. If anyone could save the emperor's life, it would be this gruff, practical man who had learned his trade cutting metal from living flesh, rather than studying ancient texts in monastery libraries. But even Seyf's skills came with a price that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The surgeon's initial examination, conducted by torchlight in a stone chamber that reeked of vinegar and herbs, confirmed everyone's worst fears. The gangrene had advanced beyond any possibility of conservative treatment. "Your Majesty," Seyf said bluntly, his hands still bloody from probing the wound, "the leg must come off, or you will be dead within a fortnight." The words hung in the frigid air like a death sentence. Never before had a reigning Holy Roman Emperor faced such a choice: submit to surgical mutilation or accept certain death. Frederick, lucid for perhaps the first time in weeks, stared at the ceiling's rough stone blocks. His empire stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, encompassing kingdoms and duchies that owed him feudal allegiance. Yet all that power meant nothing against the corruption eating through his flesh. The preparations took nearly 2 months, as Seyf assembled his instruments, and Frederick's confessor, Bishop Georg Slatkonia, prepared the emperor's soul for what might be his final ordeal. Daily mass was conducted at Frederick's bedside, though he had grown too weak to sit upright for the service. March 8th dawned grey and cold, the kind of late winter day that seems to drain color from the world. In the makeshift surgical chamber, Seyf arranged his tools with the methodical precision of a craftsman. bone saws with teeth like wolf fangs, cauterizing irons heating in a brazier until they glowed cherry red, and an array of knives, sharp enough to part flesh with surgical precision. The anesthesia consisted of an opium-soaked sponge pressed over Frederick's nose and mouth, a crude but effective method that would render him unconscious for the procedure's duration. As the drug took effect, the Emperor's breathing deepened, and his grip on consciousness finally loosened. What followed challenged every conception of imperial dignity. Safe worked with brutal efficiency, the bone saw's rasping sound echoing off stone walls as it carved through Frederick's femur. Blood loss was controlled through immediate cauterization with red-hot iron, filling the chamber with the acrid smell of burning flesh and the hiss of searing tissue. The operation lasted approximately 60 minutes, an eternity for those watching their sovereign reduced to bleeding meat on a surgeon's table. When Safe finally stepped back, wiping gore from his hands, Frederick's left leg lay severed below the knee, leaving a cauterized stump that wept blood despite the surgeon's best efforts. But had they acted quickly enough? Within hours of the amputation, alarming signs suggested the infection might have already spread beyond the surgical site. Frederick's fever continued climbing, and his pulse remained dangerously rapid. The real horror began 24 hours later, when the surgical wound reopened despite careful stitching, revealing something that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Hans Safe's hands trembled as he peeled back the blood-soaked bandages on March 24th, revealing a sight that would challenge his decades of battlefield surgery experience. Writhing white maggots, feeding on the Emperor's reopened amputation wound. The survival of the Holy Roman Empire now depended on whether medieval medicine could combat an infection that had already claimed the imperial leg and showed no signs of stopping its advance toward Frederick's vital organs. The surgeon's workshop had been transformed into a makeshift imperial hospital, its stone walls bearing witness to the most desperate medical intervention in Habsburg history. Safe had seen battlefield wounds crawling with maggots before, but never on living flesh that belonged to the most powerful man in Christendom. The sight of larvae squirming in the Emperor's surgical site represented a complete breakdown of everything 15th century medicine claimed to understand about healing. Frederick lay unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, while fever consumed his body like an internal fire. The amputation stump, which should have begun forming healthy scar tissue, instead gaped open like a mouth, revealing the raw bone Safe had so carefully sawed just weeks earlier. The surrounding flesh had taken on a mottled appearance, patches of angry red inflammation mixed with areas of suspicious grey discoloration. "Debridement," Safe muttered to his assistant, a young man whose medical education consisted entirely of watching the master work. "We must clean every trace of corruption before it spreads further." What followed was a procedure so brutal that even hardened courtiers fled the chamber rather than witness their sovereign's continued degradation. Using a combination of heated knives and forceps, Safe methodically removed every visible maggot while scraping away necrotic tissue that came away in blackened chunks. The Emperor, mercifully unconscious from opium, showed no reaction as his flesh was carved away piece by piece. The debriding process took nearly 3 hours, with fresh bleeding requiring constant attention and cauterization. The treatment protocol reflected medieval medicine's desperate creativity in the face of the unknown. Honey, valued for its supposed purifying properties, was mixed with rendered lard to create a thick paste that Safe packed into the wound cavity. This mixture, according to ancient texts, would draw out corruption while preventing evil humors from taking root in the damaged flesh. But how could such primitive remedies Hope to save a man whose body was essentially poisoning itself. Frederick's pulse continued racing at 120 beats per minute, his heart working frantically to circulate blood that carried infection to every corner of his system. Physician Laxman's daily records paint a picture of systematic organ failure, kidneys struggling to process toxins, lungs filling with fluid that made each breath a visible struggle. The political implications of Frederick's condition created a secondary crisis that played out in hushed conversations throughout the Habsburg. Maximilian remained unreachable in the Low Countries, fighting campaigns that might determine whether the Habsburgs retained their Burgundian inheritance. Without clear communication about his father's condition, the heir apparent continued making strategic decisions based on the assumption that imperial power remained stable in Vienna. May brought no improvement despite weeks of intensive treatment. Frederick's journey back to Vienna by Danube barge revealed the true extent of his deterioration. The wound continued suppurating, producing a constant flow of infected discharge that required hourly attention from attendants who struggled not to show their revulsion. His pulse remained weak and rapid, suggesting a cardiovascular system under extreme stress. The emperor's quarters on the barge had been fitted with every comfort 15th century technology could provide. Silk cushions to prevent bed sores, braziers for warmth, even a portable altar for daily mass. Yet these luxuries could not disguise the fundamental reality that Frederick was dying by degrees, his body consumed by infections that medieval medicine had no power to cure. June 6th marked a turning point in the imperial medical crisis. Bishop Slatkonia began conducting daily bedside mass, a clear indication that the court had accepted Frederick's condition as terminal. The emperor, too weak to sit upright, received communion while lying flat on his back, the sacred wine dribbling from lips that could barely maintain their grip on consciousness. Contemporary observers noted the strange juxtaposition of imperial ceremony and bodily decay. Here was a man who commanded the allegiance of kings and commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands, yet he required assistance with the most basic human functions. Attendants worked in shifts to manage his increasingly frequent episodes of incontinence, while the imperial physicians documented every symptom in meticulous detail. The summer heat of Vienna made Frederick's condition even more unbearable. His chambers required constant ventilation to dispel the odors of infection and decay, yet opening windows risked exposing the emperor to drafts that could trigger fatal chills. Palace servants developed an elaborate rotation system to maintain air circulation while preserving some semblance of imperial dignity. By August, new complications had emerged that would transform Frederick's final weeks into a medical horror show, unlike anything previously recorded in the annals of European royalty, setting the stage for a death that would redefine the very nature of imperial power. By August 12th, Emperor Frederick's abdomen had swollen so dramatically that his ceremonial robes no longer fit, fluid accumulating in his belly, while bed sores opened fresh wounds across his back and sacrum. The final collapse of imperial health was triggering a constitutional crisis. How could a dying man continue governing an empire when he could barely hold a pen to sign the documents that kept his realm functioning? The Habsburg's summer heat had transformed Frederick's chambers into a suffocating tomb for the living. Despite the best efforts of palace staff to maintain air circulation, the combination of Vienna's oppressive August temperatures and the emperor's deteriorating condition created an atmosphere that challenged even the most devoted attendants. The smell of infected flesh, mixed with the cloying sweetness of frankincense, burned constantly in futile attempts to mask the reality of imperial decay. Frederick's body had become a catalogue of medical catastrophes. The ascites fluid retention that medieval physicians attributed to corrupted humors had caused his abdominal girth to expand by 14 centimeters in just 6 weeks. This swelling created additional pressure on organs already struggling to function, making every breath a conscious effort that left the emperor gasping like a landed fish. The bed sores represented perhaps the most humiliating aspect of his decline. Despite silk sheets and the constant attention of body servants, ulcers had opened across Frederick's sacrum where his weight pressed against the mattress. These secondary wounds wept constantly, requiring hourly cleaning with wine and honey, while palace staff struggled to find positions that might offer some relief from the pressure that was literally wearing holes in the emperor's flesh. Most alarming was Frederick's inability to urinate normally, a complication that required physician Laxmond to insert reed catheters twice daily. This procedure, conducted without anesthesia in an era before understanding of sterile technique, added fresh agony to Frederick's already overwhelming catalogue of suffering. The emperor's urine, when it finally flowed, was dark and fetid, indicating kidney dysfunction that medieval medicine had no power to address. Yet, even as his body failed, Frederick's mind occasionally achieved moments of startling clarity that reminded everyone of the formidable intelligence that had sustained Habsburg power for 5 decades. August 12th witnessed one such moment when the emperor summoned enough strength to dictate and sign a codicil to his will, formally naming Maximilian as sole heir and Reichsverweser, imperial administrator. The signing ceremony revealed both Frederick's determination and his physical limitations. Count Silly had to support the emperor's hand while pressing the imperial seal into hot wax, Frederick's fingers too weak to maintain the pressure required for a clear impression. Witnesses reported that the effort left him unconscious for nearly an hour, his body simply unable to sustain even this minimal exertion. What drove Frederick to push through such suffering to complete this legal formality? The answer lay in his acute awareness that Habsburg survival depended on clear succession arrangements. Without proper documentation naming Maximilian as heir, rival claimants could challenge the transition, potentially triggering civil wars that would tear the empire apart, just as Ottoman forces pressed against Hungary's eastern borders. The emperor's daily routine had been reduced to managing successive medical crises. Morning brought the catheterization procedure, followed by wound cleaning that required 3 attendants working in coordination. Afternoons were consumed by efforts to reduce the abdominal swelling through positioning and massage techniques that provided only temporary relief. Evenings meant changing bandages soaked with discharge from multiple infected sites, while preparing opium mixtures strong enough to grant a few hours of unconsciousness. Palace life adapted around Frederick's condition in ways that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Courtiers conducted business in whispered conversations outside the imperial chambers, while important documents were brought to Frederick's bedside for approval during his brief periods of lucidity. The normal rhythms of governance, audiences with foreign ambassadors, consultations with advisors, ceremonial functions that reinforced imperial authority, had been suspended indefinitely. The psychological toll on those closest to Frederick was becoming apparent. Bishop Slatkonia's diary entries from this period reveal a man struggling to reconcile his faith with the seemingly endless suffering of his sovereign. How could divine providence allow such degradation of a ruler who had spent his reign defending Christendom? The bishop's private doubts reflected broader questions about the nature of imperial authority when stripped of physical power. August 18th brought Frederick's final formal audience with Elector Friedrich of Brandenburg, a diplomatic necessity that required extraordinary efforts to maintain some semblance of imperial dignity. The emperor was propped upright with pillows, while servants positioned screens to hide the worst evidence of his condition from the visiting dignitary. The audience lasted barely 20 minutes, with Frederick's speech so slurred by medication and weakness, that interpreters struggled to understand his words. His breathing had become labored to the point where each sentence required multiple pauses, while tremors in his hands made gesture impossible. The elector, clearly disturbed by what he witnessed, cut the meeting short with vague promises of continued alliance. As night fell on August 18th, Frederick's attendants noticed changes that suggested the end was finally approaching. His breathing had become irregular, with long pauses between each labored inhalation, while his skin took on the waxy pallor that medieval physicians recognized as death's herald. But none of them were prepared for the violence of what was about to unfold in the pre-dawn hours of August 19th. At 2:15 in the morning on August 19th, 1493, Emperor Frederick III convulsed violently in his bed as septic delirium consumed his final conscious moments, Latin prayers spilling from his lips in desperate repetition. The death of the Holy Roman Emperor would trigger a power vacuum that ambitious nobles had been anticipating for months. Within hours, the Habsburg would transform from imperial palace into a battlefield for Habsburg succession. The final 48 hours had stripped away every pretense of imperial dignity. Frederick's pupils had become fixed and dilated, staring sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling of his chamber, while his body fought its losing battle against systemic infection. The emperor, who had once negotiated with kings and popes, now existed in a twilight world where reality blended with fever-induced hallucinations. Bishop Slatkonia, maintaining his vigil beside the imperial deathbed, recorded the disturbing nature of Frederick's final delirium. The emperor repeatedly mumbled fragments of Latin liturgy, Pater Noster qui es in caelis and Ave Maria gratia plena, but mixed with what sounded like conversations with invisible courtiers. Sometimes Frederick would attempt to issue commands, his voice barely a whisper, as he tried to raise his hand in the imperial gesture of authority. The chamber itself had become a grotesque parody of royal splendor. Heavy tapestries, hung to muffle sound and preserve privacy, trapped the oppressive mixture of decay and medicinal herbs that no amount of frankincense could overcome. Candles burned continuously, their flickering light casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of the dying emperor. The massive bed, draped in Habsburg colors, had become less a throne than a scaffold where imperial power slowly bled away. Physician Laxmand monitored Frederick's failing vital signs with the dedication of a man whose own survival might depend on demonstrating he had done everything possible. The emperor's pulse had become thready and irregular, occasionally disappearing entirely before resuming with desperate rapidity. His breathing followed no consistent pattern, sometimes gasping frantically as if drowning, other times stopping for terrifying intervals that left attendants wondering if death had finally arrived. What made these final hours particularly harrowing was Frederick's apparent awareness of his approaching end during brief moments of clarity. Witnesses reported that he would sometimes open his eyes with startling lucidity, focusing on familiar faces with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly what was happening to his body. These moments of recognition were perhaps more disturbing than the delirium, revealing a keen intelligence trapped within flesh that had completely betrayed him. The emperor's physical deterioration had reached its absolute nadir. The amputation site continued weeping infected discharge despite months of treatment, while the abdominal swelling had progressed to the point where Frederick's breathing was mechanically compromised by the pressure on his diaphragm. Bedsores had opened additional wounds that refused to heal, creating multiple sites of infection that overwhelmed his body's remaining defenses. Around midnight on August 18th, Frederick experienced what witnesses described as his final coherent moment. He managed to whisper something to Bishop Slatkonia that sounded like a confession, though the exact words were never recorded. The bishop administered last rites with trembling hands, anointing the emperor's forehead with sacred oil while mumbling prayers that seemed inadequate against the magnitude of suffering in that chamber. The actual moment of death came without drama. Frederick's labored breathing simply became more irregular, with longer pauses between each inhalation, until finally there was no next breath. His eyes, which had been staring blindly at the ceiling, remained open, but lost the subtle movements that had indicated some spark of consciousness still flickered within. Laxmand confirmed what everyone already knew by checking for a pulse that was no longer there. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III had died at 2:15 in the morning, his 53-year reign ending not with the crash of armies or the pronouncement of history, but with the simple absence of breath in a chamber that reeked of decay and desperation. Within minutes of Laxmand's official pronouncement, the careful order that had maintained palace discipline during Frederick's illness began to collapse. Word spread through the Habsburg with supernatural speed, carried by servants and minor courtiers who understood that the emperor's death represented both crisis and opportunity. The Habsburg dynasty's future now depended entirely on whether Maximilian could be reached in time to claim his inheritance. But the immediate aftermath revealed just how fragile imperial authority had become. Even before Frederick's body had cooled, ambitious courtiers were already calculating advantages and positioning themselves for the power struggle that was about to engulf the Habsburg lands. The looting began before dawn, and what happened next would expose the brutal reality of political succession in an age when personal loyalty died with the monarch who commanded it. Within 3 hours of Frederick's death, Habsburg courtiers were ransacking the imperial chambers like vultures, stripping away centuries of accumulated treasure, while only physician Laxmand remained to guard the emperor's rapidly cooling corpse. The speed of this collapse revealed the terrifying fragility of medieval monarchy. Without Frederick's personal authority to enforce loyalty, his empire was already fragmenting into competing factions, scrambling for advantage. The transformation was breathtaking in its brutality. Courtiers, who had prostrated themselves before Frederick just hours earlier, now moved through his private chambers with calculating efficiency, stuffing their robes with anything portable and valuable. Gold plate disappeared into hidden pockets, while jeweled daggers and ceremonial cups vanished as if they had never existed. The imperial seal itself might have been stolen if Laxmand had not had the foresight to secure it beneath Frederick's deathbed. This wasn't random pillaging, but strategic looting by men who understood that the coming power struggle would require resources. Every stolen goblet represented potential bribes for mercenary captains, while precious stones could purchase the loyalty of wavering nobles. The Habsburg treasury, already depleted by Frederick's medical expenses and years of defensive warfare, was being systematically stripped by the very people who had sworn to protect it. Laxmand found himself in an impossible position as the sole guardian of imperial dignity. A physician trained to heal the living, he now faced the responsibility of preserving the dead emperor's honor, while predatory courtiers circled like carrion birds. His medical bag, ironically, became his only weapon. The instruments that had failed to save Frederick's life now served to threaten anyone who approached too close to the imperial corpse. The political mechanics of succession revealed themselves with clockwork precision. Even as Frederick's body temperature dropped toward that of the surrounding air, riders were already thundering through Vienna's cobblestone streets, carrying news to strategic allies. The Imperial Privy Council convened in emergency session within the Habsburg's council chamber, their deliberations conducted in urgent whispers while servants continued looting just corridors away. The council's decision came with startling speed. By dawn on August 20th, they had proclaimed Maximilian King of the Romans and acting emperor, effectively bypassing the traditional electoral process that should have confirmed Habsburg's succession. This constitutional coup reflected their acute awareness that any delay might allow rival claimants to organize opposition or foreign powers to exploit the leadership vacuum. But where was Maximilian himself? The new emperor remained unreachable in the Low Countries, commanding Habsburg forces against French armies that threatened Burgundian territories crucial to dynasty survival. Communication in the 1500s moved at the speed of horses, meaning weeks might pass before Maximilian learned of his father's death and his own elevation to imperial authority. The Regency Council faced the terrifying prospect of governing an empire in the name of a ruler who didn't yet know he held the throne. The immediate challenge was preventing news of Frederick's death from spreading beyond Vienna until Maximilian could be informed and his authority established. Medieval kingdoms survived on the perception of strength, and any indication that the Habsburg succession was uncertain could trigger rebellions from Hungary to the Netherlands. Enemy states would inevitably interpret the transition period as an opportunity for territorial expansion or diplomatic coercion. Secretary Zuttel, who had first diagnosed Frederick's fatal leg infection over a year earlier, now found himself coordinating the most elaborate deception in Habsburg history. Official proclamations continued, describing the emperor as indisposed but recovering, while court ceremonies proceeded as if Frederick might appear at any moment. This fiction required the cooperation of hundreds of palace staff, any of whom could destroy the illusion with an ill-timed revelation. The economic implications of imperial death created additional urgency. Frederick's personal debts to the Augsburg-Fugger banking family exceeded 100,000 florins, obligations that could bankrupt the Habsburg treasury if called in during a succession crisis. The council faced the delicate task of reassuring creditors that imperial finances remained stable while negotiating for additional loans that might be necessary to secure Maximilian's position. Foreign reactions varied based on each power's relationship with Habsburg authority. Hungarian King Vladislaus II dispatched his envoy Tamas Bakoch within days of Frederick's death, ostensibly offering condolences but actually probing for guarantees that existing border agreements would be honored by the new regime. The speed of this diplomatic mission suggested that Hungarian intelligence networks had penetrated Habsburg court secrecy more effectively than anyone wanted to admit. More encouraging was the papal response to the succession crisis. Pope Alexander VI issued a brief acknowledging Maximilian's elevation within a week of the council's proclamation, urging continued financial support for crusade preparations against Ottoman expansion. This quick papal recognition provided crucial legitimacy for the Regency government, while demonstrating that Rome preferred Habsburg stability to the chaos that might follow dynastic collapse. The Sforza marriage negotiations revealed the cynical calculations driving European diplomacy. Duchess Bianca Maria Sforza's dowry discussions, which had languished during Frederick's final illness, suddenly accelerated with renewed urgency. Milan's willingness to commit 400,000 ducats to a Habsburg alliance reflected their assessment that Maximilian's regime would survive its founding crisis and emerge as a valuable ally against French ambitions in northern Italy. Within Vienna itself, Frederick's death triggered a complex mixture of genuine mourning and calculating opportunism. The city council decreed 30 days of official mourning while simultaneously authorizing trade guilds to fund 1,500 wax torches for the eventual funeral procession. This combination of sentiment and commerce reflected the practical reality that imperial deaths, however tragic, also created economic opportunities for those positioned to profit from ceremonial requirements. Yet beneath all these political machinations lurked a more fundamental question about the nature of imperial authority. Frederick had ruled through personal relationships built over decades of careful diplomacy and strategic patience. Could institutional structures maintain Habsburg power without the physical presence of the monarch who had embodied that authority for 53 years? The answer would depend on whether Maximilian could reach Vienna before the carefully constructed fiction of continuity collapsed completely, exposing the dynasty to enemies who had been waiting decades for exactly such an opportunity. On August 21st, embalmers sliced open Frederick's corpse in the same chamber where he had died, removing his diseased organs, while the stench of imperial decay forced even experienced morticians to work in shifts. This macabre ritual would mark the beginning of Frederick's transformation from failed monarch into Habsburg legend, a process that would ultimately prove more successful than anything he had accomplished while alive. The embalming procedure revealed the full extent of damage that infection had wreaked throughout the emperor's body. When the embalmers opened Frederick's thoracic cavity, witnesses reported being shocked by the condition of his internal organs. His liver, swollen and discolored by months of systemic infection, had to be carefully extracted in pieces. The heart, enlarged by the strain of pumping contaminated blood, was immediately placed in a silver casket destined for Wiener Neustadt, where Frederick had spent his youth as Duke of Austria. The embalmers worked with methodical efficiency, born of grim experience. Frederick's abdominal cavity was thoroughly cleaned before being packed with myrtle, rosemary, and 15 pounds of frankincense, aromatic herbs, chosen not just for preservation, but for their symbolic significance in Christian burial traditions. The body was then washed with wine, a purification ritual that connected imperial death with sacred ceremony, while serving the practical purpose of removing final traces of decay. This tripartite burial arrangement reflected both medieval custom and political necessity. Frederick's heart would rest in the Georgskirche at Wiener Neustadt, his intestines in Graz Cathedral, while his body would occupy the imperial tomb at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. This division served multiple purposes, spreading Habsburg presence across key territories, while ensuring that pilgrimage sites would maintain Frederick's memory throughout the dynasty's lands. The funeral procession of September 3rd transformed Vienna into a theatre of imperial majesty that bore no resemblance to the squalid reality of Frederick's final months. 1,200 candles lined the graben as the massive coffin, borne by teams of professional pallbearers, moved through streets packed with mourners who had been carefully coached in appropriate displays of grief. The contrast between this orchestrated splendor and the looting that had followed Frederick's actual death revealed the sophisticated propaganda machinery that sustained medieval monarchy. Yet even in death, Frederick's body continued asserting its stubborn refusal to conform to imperial expectations. The funeral directors had constructed a coffin of unprecedented size to accommodate the emperor's remains, but the lead lining and massive oak construction created structural challenges that medieval carpentry was barely equipped to handle. The weight required additional bearers and a reinforced hearse that groaned under its burden as it moved through Vienna's narrow streets. The most revealing aspect of Frederick's funeral was what it demonstrated about the relationship between political power and popular memory. Citizens who had lived through decades of Frederick's cautious, unspectacular rule now witnessed a ceremony that portrayed him as a conquering hero, worthy of comparison to Charlemagne himself. This disconnect between reality and representation would become characteristic of Habsburg public relations, the ability to transform modest achievements into legendary accomplishments through sheer ceremonial magnificence. St. Stephen's Cathedral provided the perfect setting for this exercise in posthumous myth-making. The Gothic architecture, with its soaring spires and intricate stonework, created an atmosphere of sacred authority that enveloped Frederick's tomb in religious legitimacy. Here, surrounded by centuries of Christian symbolism, the pragmatic emperor who had survived through careful compromise was reborn as a defender of the faith and champion of Christendom. But the tomb's construction revealed the financial constraints that had plagued Frederick throughout his reign. The monumental design, commissioned from sculptor Nicholas Gerhardt, called for elaborate decorative elements that would have rivaled any European royal sepulchre. However, funding shortages meant the project remained incomplete until 1513, 20 years after Frederick's death. The delayed completion symbolized the gap between Habsburg ambitions and their available resources. The myths that accumulated around Frederick's death proved more durable than historical facts. Within decades of his burial, stories circulated claiming the emperor had been fitted with a golden prosthetic leg before his funeral, a tale that reflected popular fascination with the intersection of royal wealth and physical vulnerability. This legend persisted for centuries until 1969, when endoscopic examination of Frederick's remains confirmed that his leg stump remained intact with no evidence of any prosthetic device. More disturbing were the religious pamphlets that emerged during the Reformation, with 1560 Calvinist propaganda claiming Frederick's corpse had risen in vengeance after his botched amputation. These stories, while obviously fabricated, demonstrated how Frederick's medical ordeal had become symbolic of broader tensions between Catholic authority and Protestant reform. His physical suffering was reinterpreted as divine judgment on a monarch who had failed to embrace religious change. The political assessment of Frederick's reign underwent similar transformation over time. Contemporary critics had derided him as the peaceful, a derogatory nickname that emphasized his preference for negotiation over military action. Modern historians, however, recognize that Frederick's cautious diplomacy had actually ensured Habsburg's survival during a period when more aggressive monarchs destroyed their dynasties through overextension and reckless warfare. Frederick's death had accidentally strengthened imperial institutions by forcing the development of administrative systems that could function without constant royal intervention. The Regency Council's success in managing the succession crisis demonstrated that Habsburg power could survive the transition between rulers, a crucial precedent that would serve the dynasty well through future generations of infant kings and disputed successions. The emperor's medical records became valuable historical documents that provided unprecedented insight into 15th century royal life. Physician Laxmann's detailed notes on Frederick's symptoms and treatments created one of the most complete medical case studies from the medieval period, offering modern researchers a window into both contemporary medical practice and the physical reality of monarchy before modern healthcare. Perhaps most significantly, Frederick's ordeal humanized imperial authority in ways that traditional royal chronicles never could. His suffering stripped away the ceremonial distance that separated monarchs from their subjects, revealing a man whose body betrayed him just as thoroughly as any commoners might. This vulnerability, so carefully hidden during his lifetime, ultimately became the source of his most authentic connection to historical memory. The emperor who had feared that amputation would diminish his imperial dignity discovered instead that his willingness to endure such degradation in service of dynastic survival had transformed him into something approaching a martyred saint. Frederick III died believing he had failed his empire, never imagining that his death would prove more politically valuable than any victory he had achieved while alive.